The sound of chains. The chains around his wrists rattled as Sergeant Jake Callahan was led through the cold, sterile hallways of Black Ridge Federal Prison. His Marine instincts told him to stand tall, shoulders squared, eyes scanning his surroundings. But what was the point? The world had already branded him a traitor. The guards at his sides didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their expressions said everything: disgust, contempt, judgment. Jake had seen that look before, on the battlefield, when he was staring down insurgents in some foreign war zone. Only this time, the enemy wasn't some faceless soldier. It was his own country. They had taken everything from him: his freedom, his career, his future. But the one thing that hurt the most? They had taken his K9 partner, Shadow. They said he was a traitor, that he had sold classified intelligence to foreign enemies. The evidence was airtight. His bank account showed large deposits from an offshore source. Emails, supposedly from him, linked him to a military data breach. A witness, his former squad mate, testified that Jake had been acting suspicious before the breach. It didn't matter that Jake had never seen a single dollar from those accounts. Didn't matter that the emails had been planted. Didn't matter that he had been set up. The system wanted someone to blame, and they had chosen him. The judge's words still echoed in his skull. Sergeant Callahan, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He had stood there in that cold, impersonal courtroom, while his so-called brothers in arms refused to meet his eyes. He had fought for them, bled for them, and now they were just watching him burn. But the worst part? The moment they led him away, and he saw Shadow's handler pulling him in the opposite direction, the war dog, his war dog, was being reassigned. They wouldn't even let him say goodbye. That was the moment Jake broke. Not the conviction, not the sentence, not even the betrayal. Losing Shadow was the only thing that had truly shattered him. Get up, Callahan. You've got a visitor. Jake sat up from his cot, blinking against the dim prison lights. A visitor? He hadn't had one in 2 years. The last person who had come to see him was his court-appointed lawyer, Rachel Dawes. But even she had stopped showing up. 2 guards led him down the hallway, their grips tight on his arms, as if expecting him to run. As if there was anywhere to run. The door swung open, revealing a man in a dark suit sitting at the metal table. Not military, something else. The kind of man who lived in the shadows. The kind of man who only showed up when something needed to be buried. Jake sat across from him, saying nothing. The man leaned forward, sliding a classified folder across the table. Jake didn't move. Your conviction was a mistake, the man said, his voice calm, clipped, calculated. Jake snorted. No shit. The man smirked. You were framed, and we know who did it. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed the folder, flipping it open. A photo of a man stared back at him. Major Nathan Briggs, Jake's former commanding officer. The man who had testified against him. The man who had sent him here. His pulse slowed, a dangerous calm settling over him. What do you want? He asked, voice low. The man folded his hands. We need your help bringing him down. Jake's jaw clenched. And what do I get? The man exhaled. Your freedom, your record wiped clean. A pause. And your K9 partner. The air in the room changed. Jake's breath hitched. Shadow, he murmured. The agent nodded. You do this job, Callahan? You get your life back. You get him back. Jake's hands tightened into fists. Shadow was alive, not retired, not put down. Still working, still waiting. Jake took a slow breath, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt something he thought he had lost. Hope. He met the agent's eyes. When do we start? They flew him out the next day, a military training base in the middle of nowhere. Jake stepped onto the dirt, the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and iron filling his lungs. His heart was hammering, because somewhere in that compound, Shadow was waiting. The handler leading the way spoke without looking at him. He's been reassigned, had a new handler for the last 2 years. Don't expect much. These dogs are trained to move on. Jake said nothing, because he knew better. They stepped into the training yard, a dozen handlers, a dozen K9's, and then his eyes locked onto one, Shadow. The massive black Belgian Malinois stood at attention. His coat sleek and scarred, his posture perfect. The handler held his leash tight. "Don't be surprised if he doesn't remember you," the guy muttered. "He's had a lot of training since—" Jake whistled, a sharp two-tone whistle. Shadow's ears twitched. The dog froze. Jake's heart stopped. For a second, just a second, the entire world was silent. Then, Shadow lunged. The handler wasn't ready. The leash ripped from his hands as Shadow bolted, straight toward Jake. Gasps filled the air. Jake barely had time to brace himself before 90 pounds of pure muscle slammed into him, knocking him onto his back. Shadow's whine was sharp, broken, desperate. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, hands gripping the dog's fur as Shadow pressed against him, tail whipping back and forth. Shadow hadn't forgotten. Not for a second. The handlers watched in shock. One muttered, "Holy shit." Jake laughed, raw and shaky. "You never moved on, did you, boy?" Shadow licked his face once, then let out a low, protective growl, his body tensing. Jake followed his gaze. Shadow was staring at the officers watching them. Jake's stomach turned to ice. Shadow wasn't just happy. He was on alert. He sensed danger. Jake slowly pushed himself up, his muscles coiling. Because whatever Shadow had just figured out, it meant one thing. This mission was about to get a hell of a lot more complicated. The air was electric, tension thick enough to choke on. Shadow wasn't moving. His massive black frame was rigid, muscles tight, his amber eyes locked onto the group of officers watching them. And Jake Callahan knew that look. This wasn't a dog simply recognizing an old handler. This was a war dog identifying a threat. A real one. Jake slowly pushed himself up, never taking his eyes off the people standing just beyond the training yard's fence. His heart pounded, steady but hard, years of instinct slamming back into place. Shadow let out a low, guttural growl. Jake had spent years reading that sound. It wasn't anger, it wasn't excitement, it was a warning. Something was wrong, and Shadow could smell it. Jake forced himself to breathe, to act natural, even as his gut screamed at him to get the hell out of here. The handler standing next to him, a fresh-faced lieutenant who clearly didn't understand what was happening, chuckled nervously. "Man, I've never seen a dog react like that before," he muttered. Jake didn't answer. He kept his gaze on the men watching them. One in particular, Major Nathan Briggs, the man who had testified against him. The man who had sworn under oath that Jake was guilty. The man who had put him behind bars. Briggs's face was unreadable, but his hands twitched. And that was all Jake needed to see. Shadow's ears flicked back, his growl deepening. Jake slowly knelt beside him, running his hand down the dog's back. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Talk to me." Shadow's head snapped toward Briggs again, his entire body vibrating with something raw and primal. Jake's mind raced. Shadow had been there the night of the breach, the night the military claimed Jake had leaked classified intel. But Shadow had been with Jake the entire time, which meant if the dog was reacting like this, then Briggs had been there too, which meant Jake had just found his real enemy. The group of officers began walking toward them. Briggs was in front, flanked by two heavily armed MPs, their faces hard, unreadable. Shadow stood taller, his body now fully rigid. Jake forced himself to relax, even as his pulse hammered. They weren't here to congratulate him on his freedom. Briggs stopped a few feet away, offering a tight, cold smile. "Sergeant Callahan," he said, "you've had quite a day." Jake kept his expression neutral. "Yeah," he said. "I have." Briggs's eyes flicked down to Shadow. "Seems your dog still remembers you." Jake tilted his head. "Seems like he remembers more than that." Briggs's smile faltered. For the first time since Jake had walked onto this base, he saw it. Fear, a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was there. And that was enough. Jake didn't move, didn't blink. Briggs didn't either. Shadow's growl rumbled through the silence. The men standing behind Briggs shifted, their fingers twitching near their weapons. Jake felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't just a friendly debriefing. This was a setup. Briggs had never expected Jake to get out of prison, and now he had to clean up his mess. Jake exhaled slowly, calculated his options. He was unarmed, outnumbered, on a military base surrounded by men who still thought he was guilty. But what Briggs didn't know, Jake had spent his whole life fighting battles he wasn't supposed to win. and he still had Shadow. Briggs took another step forward. Jake saw the decision flash across his face. He was going to make a move, so Jake did too, fast. He dropped to one knee, pressing his hand against Shadow's back, giving one single, silent command. Go! Shadow exploded forward. Briggs barely had time to react before 90 pounds of War Dog slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. The MPs shouted, scrambling to draw their weapons. Jake moved first. He grabbed the first MP's wrist, twisting sharply, disarming him before he could even pull the trigger. The second MP raised his rifle. Jake grabbed the first guy's sidearm and fired, a single shot. The MP's rifle flew from his hands, not dead, just disarmed. The entire base exploded into chaos. Alarms blared, soldiers shouted, and Jake grabbed Briggs by the collar, yanking him to his feet. Call it off, he growled. Briggs spat blood, glaring. You're dead, Callahan. Jake cocked the stolen pistol, pressing it against Briggs's temple. Not before you. Briggs's breathing stuttered. The MPs hesitated, waiting for orders. Jake leaned in. You set me up. You put me away. You think I don't know? Briggs's jaw clenched. Then, Shadow let out a sharp bark. Jake turned, and what he saw made his blood go cold. A group of black SUVs had just pulled up outside the fence. Not military. Something else. Something worse. Jake looked back at Briggs. The man was smiling. You think I'm the one you should be worried about? Briggs muttered. Jake's grip tightened, because suddenly, he realized, this went way deeper than he thought. This wasn't just a military betrayal. This was bigger. And whatever was in those SUVs, they weren't here to arrest Briggs. They were here to erase everything, including him. Jake took a breath, looked down at Shadow, and smirked. Guess we're not done yet, buddy. Shadow let out a low, eager growl. Then Jake spun, gun raised, and everything erupted into war. The black SUVs skidded to a stop just outside the fence. Engines rumbled, doors swung open, and out stepped a group of men in tactical gear, faces hidden, movements sharp, professional. Not military, not law enforcement. Something worse. Shadow's ears flattened, his muscles coiling like a spring, his growl low and ready. Jake didn't need a patch on their arms to know who they were. Private military contractors. Hired guns, no oversight, no rules. Jake had worked with their kind before, the type of men who made people disappear. They weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to clean up the mess. And that meant one thing. Jake Callahan and Shadow were officially expendable. Step 1, survive the ambush. Jake had seconds to react. Briggs saw his chance, elbowed Jake hard in the ribs, and made a break for it, sprinting toward the SUVs. Jake barely had time to curse before the first bullet zipped past his ear. Sniper. Shit! Shadow, move! The War Dog sprang into action, diving toward cover as Jake did the same, rolling behind a row of sandbags. More shots rang out, tearing through the air. Briggs had almost made it to the contractors. Jake popped up from cover, lined up a shot. BAM. Briggs dropped mid-stride, his leg buckling. Not dead. But he wasn't running anywhere now. The contractors opened fire, covering their fallen asset. Jake ducked, gritting his teeth. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he had one advantage: Shadow. Jake whistled twice, sharp, controlled. Shadow darted low, weaving through debris, moving like a missile locking onto a target. One of the contractors turned too late. Shadow hit him hard, taking him down in a flurry of snarling teeth and pure muscle. The guy screamed as Shadow's jaws clamped down. Jake moved fast, flanking the remaining men while they were distracted. Gun up, 2 shots, 2 down. The last man hesitated, seeing the others fall. Jake didn't give him time to think. He lunged forward, grabbing the contractor's rifle, twisting it away. A single vicious punch to the throat sent the guy crumpling to the ground. Jake turned, breathing hard. It was over in seconds. Shadow released the man he had taken down, his muzzle dripping with blood, tail wagging like he had just finished a training exercise. Jake looked down at Briggs, who was writhing on the ground, clutching his shot-out knee. The former officer looked up, eyes wild with fear. You have no idea what you just did," he stammered. Jake knelt beside him. "Oh, I think I do." Briggs gritted his teeth. "They won't let you walk away from this." Jake smirked. "They can try." Then he pulled the hard drive from Briggs's pocket. the one Briggs had been so desperate to protect. Jake flipped it over in his hands. The answers were inside. Whatever had gotten him locked away, framed, betrayed. It was on this drive. Jake stuffed it in his vest. Then he stood, whistling for Shadow. "Time to go, buddy." Shadow snorted, stepping over the unconscious bodies. Jake turned, walking toward the fence line, the sound of sirens now blaring in the distance. Briggs shouted after him, "You can't run forever, Callahan." Jake didn't even glance back. He just smiled. "Watch me." And then he disappeared into the night. Step 2. The escape. Jake and Shadow moved fast, cutting through the trees behind the base, keeping low. They had a few minutes, maybe less, before reinforcements arrived. Shadow stayed at his side, silent, focused. Jake felt the adrenaline pounding in his skull, but he kept moving. This wasn't his first time running for his life, and it wouldn't be his last. His goal? Get to Frankie Morales. The former Air Force intelligence officer owed him a favor, and right now, Jake needed all the help he could get. Step 3. The hard drive's secret. 12 hours later, Safe House, New Mexico. Jake sat at an old wooden table, watching as Frankie hacked into the hard drive. Shadow lay beside him, tail flicking, ears twitching at every little noise. Frankie's eyes widened as files began flashing across the screen. "Holy shit," he breathed. Jake leaned in. "What am I looking at?" Frankie exhaled sharply. "Not just stolen intel, man. Weapons deals, illegal ops, black market transactions. This isn't just about you. This is bigger." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "How big?" Frankie looked up, his face serious. "Pentagon big." Jake leaned back. "South." That's why they had framed him. That's why they had locked him away. He had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. And now they weren't just going to let him run. They were going to erase him. Step 4. The war ahead. Frankie scratched his head. "You realize this means that you're officially screwed, right?" Jake smirked. "Not yet." Frankie sighed. "What's the plan?" Jake looked down at Shadow, who was already watching him, waiting. The war dog sensed it, knew what was coming. Jake patted the dog's head, then turned back to Frankie. "We don't run," he said. Frankie raised an eyebrow. "Then what do we do?" Jake exhaled. "We go hunting." Frankie stared at him. Then he grinned. "God damn, I missed you, Callahan." Jake smirked, standing up, checking his gear. Shadow wagged his tail once, sharp and eager. Because now. This wasn't about survival. This was about payback. And Jake Callahan never left a job unfinished. Safe House, New Mexico. 2,300 hours. The glow of the laptop screen bathed the dimly lit room in cold blue light. Jake Callahan leaned forward, eyes locked on the classified documents Frankie Morales had just pulled from the hard drive. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching at every little noise, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes, always watching. Jake was used to war. He had spent years hunting ghosts in the desert, tracking targets the government swore didn't exist. But this was bigger than anything he had ever been part of, because this wasn't just about him. This was about the system that betrayed him, the same system that had framed him, thrown him in a cell, and stolen his life. And now he had proof. Frankie exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Man, this is bad. I mean, really bad." Jake's jaw tightened. "What are we looking at?" Frankie scrolled through the files. "These aren't just random payoffs. This is a network, multiple officers, intelligence agents, even a goddamn senator, all connected to illegal weapons sales and black ops missions that were never sanctioned." Jake felt his pulse slow. "Who's running it?" Frankie's fingers flew across the keyboard. A name flashed onto the screen. General Arthur Beckett. Jake's stomach turned to ice, because he knew that name. Beckett had been one of the top military strategists in the country, a legend, and apparently, the man behind everything. Frankie whistled. "If this guy goes down, he's taking half of DC with him." Jake leaned back, breathing slow. "Then, let's make sure he falls hard." Beckett wasn't just some desk jockey. He was former Delta Force, smart, calculated, a survivor. If they were going to take him down, they needed to make a move fast, before he disappeared. Frankie pulled up a flight manifest. "Got him," he said. He's scheduled to leave the country in 36 hours. Private jet, no paper trail, he's running. Jake's fists clenched. Not happening. Jake tapped Shadow's head. "We're not letting him go, buddy." Shadow let out a low, eager growl. Frankie sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So, what's the play?" Jake smirked. "We crash his party, Blackfield Airstrip, 0200 hours." Jake watched from the shadows, the night sky stretching over the abandoned desert airstrip. A single private jet sat on the tarmac, its engines idling, the pilot waiting. Beckett was here, and he wasn't alone. Jake counted at least 10 guards, all armed, moving in tight formation. These weren't rookies, they were killers. Shadow stayed low beside him, his breathing steady, his eyes locked on the targets. Jake whispered, "You see that guy on the left?" Shadow's ears twitched. "Take him!" The war dog slipped into the darkness, moving like a shadow himself. Jake waited. Then, a scream. One of the guards went down hard, Shadow ripping into his arm, his snarl echoing through the night. Jake moved, fast. Silent shots tore through the air. One guard dropped, then another. The contractors scrambled for cover, shouting into radios, trying to find the ghost that was hunting them. Beckett's voice roared from the plane. "Get this goddamn jet in the air, now!" Not happening. Jake sprinted forward, grabbing a flashbang from his vest, pulled the pin, tossed. Boom! The air erupted in light and sound. The guards stumbled, disoriented. Jake didn't hesitate. 2 more shots. More bodies hit the ground. Shadow raced toward the jet, weaving between crates, heading straight for Beckett. Jake sprinted after him, reloading on the run. He could see Beckett at the base of the jet's stairs, shouting into his phone, his face twisted in rage. Jake raised his gun. Then, a gunshot rang out. Pain exploded in Jake's shoulder. He staggered, gritting his teeth. Shadow snapped toward the shooter, letting out a snarl as he launched toward him. Jake forced himself to stay standing. Beckett was still there, still running. Jake couldn't let him escape. He pushed through the pain, lifted his gun, took a breath, and fired. 1 shot. Straight through Beckett's leg. The general screamed, collapsing onto the tarmac. The fight was over. Beckett lay on the ground, groaning, clutching his leg. Jake stood over him, gun still raised. Shadow circled, his growl low, dangerous. Beckett looked up, his face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. Jake smirked. "I think I do." He pulled a small recorder from his pocket, still blinking red. Beckett's face paled. Jake crouched down, holding the recorder in front of him. "Smile for the press, General," he muttered. "Because this was going straight to the news. And Beckett wasn't just going to prison. He was going down in history as a traitor." Jake stood up, holstering his weapon. "You tried to bury me," he said. "Now the whole world knows your name." Beckett spat blood, glaring. "This isn't over." Jake smiled. "Yeah, it is." Then he turned to Shadow. "Let's go home, buddy." Shadow barked once, tail wagging, and just like that, they walked away. Free, finally free. 1 week later, Jake stood at a quiet cabin in Montana, staring out at the endless stretch of open land. Shadow sat beside him, tail flicking. For the first time in years, there were no cages, no betrayals, no war, just peace. Jake reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ear. "You ever gonna stop watching my 6?" Shadow let out a short bark. Jake chuckled. "Yeah, didn't think so." Together, they watched the sunset over the mountains. And for the first time in years, Jake Callahan was finally home. That's a wrap. If you want a sequel where Jake and Shadow take on another mission together, let me know.